Thanks for coming to our latest ABNYChats. The city earlier this month announced the results of its annual housing vacancy survey, and just 1.4% of apartments in our city were vacant, making this moment the toughest housing market in over 50 years. And look, we know this is a problem for everybody. Pre-pandemic, we were kind of having a slightly different conversation. Back then, advocates, communities, and officials frequently clashed over levels of affordability in publicly subsidized housing. That's because, obviously, the lowest income New Yorkers were the first to feel the pressure of our broken housing market. But since then, this crisis has really multiplied. If you're already on the property ownership ladder in a rent-stabilized apartment or in public housing, you still have some degree of security, and you might not feel how dire it is out there for everybody else, but nearly everybody else is feeling boxed out or kind of stuck. I think especially if you're looking for a new apartment, you're a senior trying to move, you're trying to grow a little bit, it's hard. And we all run up to the same problem, which is there's just not enough of it, and we're all kind of getting crushed by how expensive it is. So I think it's hard for us to be a vibrant city. ABNY really wants New York to be a long-term vibrant city. We've been at this for a long time. What we mean by that, an innovative city, a welcoming city, where like families can grow and you can be multi-generational. You could live maybe close to your family or in the next neighborhood or the next neighborhood or the next neighborhood. That's kind of fading out, I think, unfortunately, for many people. And a city where people of different levels of income can live. And by the way, if we can't solve this problem, there kind of is a path for us that I think is really harmful. So today, some of our best and brightest, some unlikely bedfellows are coming together to try to solve this crisis. Two of them are here today from different sides of the housing ecosystem. We're thrilled to have them. Before I introduce them, I just want to note that Ruth Ann Visnakis is here, the Commissioner CEO of New York State Homes and Community Renewal. We're grateful for your work. Thank you for being here. Our two speakers today. First, Senator Brian Kavanagh from Manhattan. He is the State Senate's Housing Committee Chair. Any major reforms to our state laws about land use, taxation, and production will flow through his committee. He has held elected office since 2007, had a brief term in the Koch administration, worked for the entire Giuliani administration, and as he just told me, hung on for a moment or two within the Giuliani administration. So we're grateful to have you here.
That was
Entire Dinkins, sorry. Koch Dinkins, sorry. Entire Dinkins, my apologies. And Rafael Cestero is the CEO of the Community Preservation Corporation, one of the giants in the world of affordable housing that has been financing projects across the city going back to the 70s. For those of you who don't know him well, under the Bloomberg administration, he was the head of HPD. So I know we're all eager to hear from them. It's a big session ahead. Love to know what you think about 421A and other things. Gentlemen, we're thrilled to have you here at ABNY. Rafael, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. This is it's great to be here, and thanks to everybody at ABNY for hosting this. It's funny. I didn't have a question in here about 421A, so maybe I guess we might have to. Surprising, yeah. No, I'm teasing. So, Senator, thank you. Obviously, you are at the center of a lot that's happening in Albany this session. We hope in a very productive way. You've always been a very productive supporter and advocate of affordable housing and of housing in general. And so, look, I think probably the way to start this is at the highest level, right? There's recent data that came out. I mean, the governor started this conversation last year with a different frame, which was about 1.2 million jobs added over 10 years, but only 400,000 units of housing. The housing vacancy survey just came out, lowest vacancy rate in 50 years plus. So it's hard for people, I think, to really understand what all of that means. For people like me, it's hard after being in this business for 35 years to think about how we solve this problem without massive amounts of new production of housing, and all of that centers around the legislative authority in Albany for land use, for production, for taxation. And so at the biggest picture, before we get into some of the weedy stuff, what are the solutions as you see them for our housing crisis, and how big a role does new production play in that?
Thank you. First of all, just let me thank Rubenstein for hosting us. ABNY, which is at the center of so much of what we do in New York, and really bringing people together for important conversations like this. And Rafael is a terrific advocate. And if I don't know any questions, I am going to turn them over to Ruth Ann or Jolie or some of the other people in the room who know more than I do. So production. The governor, I think, particularly, a lot of people have talked about this for a while, but I think the governor particularly highlighted last year that production has lagged, not just within New York City, but in the New York City metropolitan area and in some other parts of the state as well, but particularly, from the Hudson Valley down out into Long Island and certainly the city itself. There is no... I think there's no long-term solution to what really is we really do face a series of interlocking crises. It's a housing supply crisis, it's a homelessness crisis, it's an eviction crisis, it's an affordability crisis. A great percentage of New Yorkers are paying way more than they can afford in their rent just to live here. There's no solution to all that without very substantially increasing housing production, and not just in a sort of short-term blip, let's get some more units online, but in a long-term way. That is likely long-term to involve New York doing what many states, what basically every state with this kind of housing market has already done, which is some incursion of the state into the ability of localities to block production of housing. And the governor, focused a great deal on that, and a lot of us, including myself, were with her, but we couldn't put that together for various reasons. It also does involve ensuring that the tax and the other financial aspects of production in New York City, that we're getting those things right. And just while we're at it, beyond production, as both a political matter and I think a policy matter, we really do need to address the fact that people massive numbers of people feel unstable in the housing they have. So tenant protections, rental assistance are going to be a critical part of that. And even if you're some, sort of pure capitalist who thinks the government should not be making, taking those steps and, the market would figure out, which I would, dispute. Just as a practical matter, it's very difficult for the political system to adopt policies that have enormous amounts of new construction while we have ongoing massive displacement of people and eviction rates that historically would have been viewed as outrageous and now have become viewed as the norm. So I think it is each of those pieces, and I think figuring it out is something we're hoping to do very soon in Albany.
That would be great. So it sounds simple. All right, we're done. So let's talk for a second. I want to take a couple of different pieces of that conversation, and I'm going to steal a line from a good friend of mine, Mark Yar, who's the former head during the Bloomberg administration of the Housing Development Corporation. He likes to say the math of affordable housing is cruel. And it's cruel for the city in terms of the amount of subsidy that it has to put in, the state in terms of the amount of subsidy it has to put in. It's cruel for tenants. It's cruel for developers. It's cruel for owners. But let's just focus for a second on some basic numbers. And this is the way I do math, so it's a little scary. But based on what we know across the CPC portfolio, it costs almost $10,000 per unit per year to just do the basic maintenance and operating of a rental housing unit. So figure that's $900-ish, between $900 and $1,000 a month, just to operate the building. That does not include taxes. That does not include debt service. The average, if you make $25,000 a year in New York City. Right, we learned today in the New York Times article horribly that 1 in 4 children in New York live in poverty. Right, so you have an enormous number of people in New York City that that make $25,000 a year, just as a round number. Right, the rent you can afford at 30% of your income is $625. We can't produce housing at that rent level at the scale at which we need to do that. So before we get into production incentives, and other things. You have long been a big proponent of vouchers and the importance of vouchers in really helping the lowest income people. The city of New York has done an enormous amount around vouchers. Unfortunately, our federal partners haven't necessarily stepped up to the plate the way we had hoped they would. But talk a little bit about the bill that you have been pushing in Albany and how you see vouchers playing a critical role in the equation.
Yeah, thanks. So I thought you were going to go to a different direction. So we should talk about the sort of the basic finances of existing housing too. Which
Yeah, we will. We're going to go there.
But just coming out of Democrats took the majority in the Senate in 2019. I became the housing chair in January 2019. We had did several very big things in 2019, including the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, which I assume is a mixed this is a mixed audience in terms of your enthusiasm for that. But in 2020, looking ahead, the idea was to figure out how to properly subsidize people whose income is such that they just genuinely cannot afford the cost of housing. And what we proposed is basically it's a state-funded Section 8 style rental assistance program. We called it the Housing Access Voucher Program because all the good names of housing programs have already been taken, the ones that spell acronyms that can be pronounced. But basically, it's I think there's a recognition that although New York State is spending a great deal of money, although HCR, Ruth Ann and her colleagues are spending that money very well, there is not enough funding going to the system to meet this core need. And so Section 8 is a model that's worked for a very long time that basically says they'll pay up to around the fair market rent. Sometimes there's a little wiggle room there, and the resident pays the difference between the resident pays up to 30% of their income, and the voucher pays the difference. And that is a model that was innovative half a century ago and has now become, it's basically a standard thing. We know it works pretty well, and it avoids some of the pitfalls of some other public assistance policies where there's no cliff. As you do a little better, you pay a little more, and it would have the benefit of subsidizing families and individuals who to stabilize them and allow them to live in the community. So it would also have the benefit of ensuring that the flow of rent to property owners is smooth and adequate. And we did. With respect to the rent stabilization system, we actually passed a law a couple of years ago that permits nonprofit landlords who are holding rent-stabilized apartments to receive the fair market rent from, which is substantially higher. I think the housing vacancy, these numbers are fresh, but I think housing vacancy survey said about 86% of rent-stabilized apartments are going at less than fair market rent right now. For what it's worth, the free market, that figure is 66%. So rent stabilization is not the only thing that's leading to the fact that people are getting less than fair market rent. But we passed all that would allow nonprofit owners to get that fair market rent rather than whatever the legal rent for the duration of that tenant's residence while there's a voucher in place. And that was designed partly to help stabilize some of these nonprofit landlords that are renting to folks at rates that are sometimes hard to maintain the building.
So I want to stay on this topic for a second, and I want to go first to where I think you thought I was going to go in the first place, which is the HSTPA Act, which were the changes to the rent stabilization laws in 2019, essentially has severely limited the ability of owners to get rent increases other than what is approved by the Rent Guidelines Board, which we know that process is what that process is. So one of the things that folks like myself worry about a great deal is vouchers can help, but at the end of the day, we may have in some respects ensured that rent-stabilized units are going to, the rents are going to remain lower and more affordable. But we have a housing stock, given the math that I was talking about before, that doesn't leave a lot of room for significant capital improvements, turn of older apartments, replacing roofs, replacing boilers, windows, facade work, not to even mention the local law 97 work to electrify buildings and that all the buildings have to comply with. And so I'm interested in your thoughts on how do we ensure that our housing stock, our existing housing stock, remains of reasonable quality and sort of continues to uphold that that old decent and safe part of the decent, safe, and affordable that we try to get to.
It's a good question. So 2019 really was a pretty radical departure from the direction that housing policy had gone in New York City, particularly with respect to rent stabilization. So for many years, the real estate industry, at least the portion of the real estate industry that was interested in the rent stabilization conversation, would push for provisions that permitted rapid increases and deregulation as the primary driver of making a return on their investments. So we had 300,000 units that had been rent stabilized that were entirely deregulated, and the rents in those apartments escalated very dramatically, often in very short periods, and often with the result of displacing a lot of folks. And that was a core business model. I represented Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village, and when MetLife decided to be not to be a mutual company but a public company and wanted to extract the value of that wonderful property, and eventually sold it to Tishman Speyer at $5.5 billion, which is apparently the largest single property residential real estate transaction in the history of the world. The goal was to remove almost all of the 28,000 families who lived there because the apartments would be more valuable vacant than occupied. And housing policy that is based on making a profit by displacing people is just not, it's not good policy, it's not good for the city, it's not good for stable communities and all the things that we talk about when we think about why housing policy is important. But that was the principal route to, the principal things that we were pushed to do over my many years when that fight was happening was make vacancy bonuses. You got 20% every time it turned over. For one year, the big reform was you could only get a 20% vacancy increase once a year. It used to be that if you could induce 3 vacancies in a single year, you would get compounded 20%, 20%, 20%. You'd almost a 70% rent increase in a single year in the legal rent. So there were all kinds of things that were intended to push the legal rent up and to deregulate. HSTPA basically eliminated all of that. We just did another bill that the governor signed in December that closed 1 or 2 more things that we considered loopholes. But effectively, you've got rent-stabilized apartments, and the policy is designed such that you are supposed to invest based on the rent roll and your future expectation of growth in the rent roll, and not based on your ability to get a totally different class of tenants in there. I think that's directionally, that is the right, I feel strongly that is the right way to go, and certainly a lot of my colleagues in the legislature thought so as well, and Andrew Cuomo signed it into law. It does, though, change the market in a pretty fundamental way, and I think it is worth thinking about how we address the need of these properties to be, the needs to maintain the property. And I think we also should, it's important, Mark Willis, who I don't think is here, has done a lot of work on segmenting the rent stabilized stock into buildings where almost all of the apartments are rent stabilized, and other buildings where, a substantial fraction of them are market rate. I often have property owners come to tell me and say, well, I've got a vacant apartment and I don't want to rent it because the cost of renting that apartment is, the income I'd get from renting the apartment is less than the average cost of the building, of a unit in that building, and that's obviously not the math. The question is the sort of marginal cost of adding another tenant better than, more than the marginal cost of the marginal rent that you'll get from that one unit. But buildings that are overwhelmingly rent stabilized are going to either be viable based on RGB increases, or we're going to have to think about other ways of adjusting the income that's coming in. And the big elements are individual apartment improvements, which were we widely viewed them as a more or less a moral hazard. You could basically assert that you were spending $80,000 in a unit and raise the rent by $2,000 a month. We think that the unleveraged rate of return on that $80,000 was 23% a year. And there was also almost no way to enforce that system. In theory, a tenant in a new apartment was supposed to look around and say, this unit doesn't seem like it got $80,000 since the last tenant was here. I'm going to challenge the rent. So we severely capped the IAIs. 50. You can spend no more than 15. You can spend as much as you want, but you can only charge a rent increase based on $15,000 of that. And the major capital improvements are not capped, but there is a schedule of kind of reasonable costs. And in both cases, we reduced the rate at which, basically the rate at which you recoup that money through rent increases. Now, there's been talk about whether we got those numbers right. We had a hard deadline of June 15th, 2019 to pass that law. And, we had various negotiations and got a lot of input. But, I think it's worth talking about, the $15,000 cap is quite low for a turnover in an apartment. And, we've certainly, I've publicly said I think it's worth considering whether that should be raised. We want to be careful not to go back to a situation where the basic mechanism, though, and there are several proposals coming from the real estate industry, where the basic mechanism is to allow really dramatic increases on individual apartments, especially upon vacancy. I think that's a non-starter because it will go back to all the really problematic dynamics we had before 2019.
Yeah, I think that's something in this conversation that you and I can agree on. I think that the challenge, I think, right now is that, we have a rent guidelines board system that is a highly charged system where, getting more than 2% or maybe, if you're lucky, 3% a year in rent guidelines board increases is, on the flip side of that, we're seeing operating expenses go up 20+%. And that is driving a lot of challenges for property owners. It's driving a lot of challenges for all kinds of owners of affordable housing, owners of rent-regulated housing, owners of market rate housing. And so, one of the things, and we're gonna finish with a bang with the production side of this, but one of the things that I know the legislature has also been talking about, because a culprit in that rising expense equation, not the only culprit, but a culprit in that rising expense equation is insurance. And we're seeing across our portfolio 25-30% increases in insurance premiums. We're seeing buildings in certain parts of the city who are just being dropped and can't, get insurance. Insurance is a complicated business. It's not federally regulated. It's regulated by the states. I know that you have been very open to conversations around what the legislature can do on insurance. It's not as simple as just outlawing premium increases in insurance. So talk to us a little bit about your thoughts on this challenge, some of the problems with it. A lot of people are saying this is like the redlining of the 1970s. I think there's some parallels. It's not a perfect parallel. So talk to us a little bit about what's in conversation at the legislature around insurance.
Yeah, so we passed a bill actually a couple of years ago, basically having a study produced by HCR and by the Department of Financial Services, just reviewing the question of whether there appears to be, what's driving increases in affordable housing insurance and and whether it appears to be discrimination. And the report, there was a short deadline. It was it ended up being somewhat anecdotal report because there was no time to do a rigorous analysis. But it does appear from all kinds of evidence we've gotten that insurance companies are discriminating, whether it's illegal is a separate question, but discriminating based on whether housing is affordable, whether the percentage of Section 8 tenants is too high, whether not, and this is exclusive of what neighborhood it's in or other kind of factors that you might think are actuarially valid. So that appears to be the low-hanging fruit, to say you cannot you can't discriminate. And it does feel a great deal like redlining, like old school redlining. Having said that, and I think that's the low-hanging fruit, and there's a proposal in the governor's budget, the executive budget, that addresses that. We've had a couple of pieces of legislation that's somewhat broader. We are planning on doing some hearings on this. But I think the more complicated question is how you ensure that, no pun intended, that insurance is available, that it's affordable, and it's not that insurance companies are making rational choices in a world where we know that claims based on climate change and other things are going up. Somebody told me that this is all being driven by plaintiffs' lawyers in the Bronx getting excessive payouts, and it's like, that seems, I would like to see the data that the Bronx has fundamentally changed in terms of the willingness of juries to give awards to plaintiffs. But I think there's obviously something broader happening, and it's not just in New York City, and we are really addressing it. I would just say, if I may, the other driver of cost that we have greater control over is taxes. And it has been widely known for a long time that multifamily housing is overtaxed relative to value compared to other classes of property. That might have been more sustainable in a world where people were deregulating and rapidly increasing the value of their property. Property that is rent regulated or almost entirely or entirely rent regulated has a very predictable and somewhat fixed increase in value over time. The income that you're going to get is pretty well defined by a governmental process. I think it's an interesting question whether, and property tax reform is sort of the holy grail of all kinds of reform, but I do think that is a particular issue that we ought to be considering addressing at the city level, is whether the taxes on these properties are justified in a world where they're permanently rent stabilized, and we very much know how much income they're going to bring in.
It's either the holy grail or the third rail. I'm not sure which, but it's or maybe both. But I'm glad you brought up taxes because obviously one of the hot items that is being talked about all over the city is, with the expiration of 421A, is there going to be anything to replace it? I think that the scene for this conversation just in the last 18 months has changed dramatically, with a number of things that we've already talked about: rapid increases in operating expenses, changes in the rent regulation system, the lack of production is reflected in the vacancy rate in the housing vacancy survey, 1.4%. For those that aren't housing nerds in the room, generally a healthy housing market is seen as having a greater than 5% vacancy rate. So 1.4 is astonishingly low. We have two of the best public agencies in the country at producing housing. Both New York City HPD and New York State HCR are the elite of the elite. And we produce subsidized affordable housing at rates that aren't seen anywhere else in the country. But for the last couple of years, that's effectively the production that we've seen in our city, is whatever has been started construction by HCR or HPD. And having spent a chunk of my career in government at a different time, I think one of the things that we need to wrestle with as a city is how much of our housing system can we put onto government to regulate or to drive the production of. And one of the great things about the 421A system, there was a lot of not great things about the old system, but one of the great things is it was a relatively low-touch system for government. It was effectively an as-of-right tax abatement. You had to qualify, but everybody knew what the box was. And it incentivized housing production in a significant way. And so I'm curious about your thoughts currently. Obviously, this was a big topic last year. Didn't get across the finish line for a whole host of reasons. a lot of people hang it, hang the, the reason it didn't get across the finish line on one particular bill around good cause. I don't know that it's always that clear.
It's not.
It might be a little more nuanced, perhaps. But I think that a conversation about this question of how do we have a system, given that I think we would agree it's probably unlikely we're going to do a complete overhaul of our taxation system this year. How do we do something that can jumpstart housing production in a world in which we desperately need more housing in New York City? And I get the Westchester, Hudson Valley, Long Island argument, but that does not change the fact that, we have the ability to produce more in New York City. My old friend from the Bloomberg era, Vishant Chakrabarty, wrote a great article in the New York Times a couple weeks ago about how, where and what lots and at what scale we could create another 500,000 units of housing. I thought it was amazing, not uncontroversial, but still was like a visual representation of what we can do if we could figure out a way to make the math work. And so I'd love to hear more from you about tax incentives to spur production.
Yeah, New York, for such a crowded, New York is a much more crowded city than most big cities in America, and notwithstanding that, New York has done a pretty good job, at least from an American policy perspective, of producing housing. We've produced housing at a little more than 2/3 of the national rate per capita in a city that's, almost 50% denser than San Francisco. I started by talking about, the broader metropolitan area and suburbs, and it's important not to lose that. We're not going to solve this problem within the 5 boroughs, as long as Long Island is producing housing at about 20% of the national rate per capita, which is really, a problem. But I think a lot of us recognize that we do need a tax incentive to promote housing production in general and affordability in particular. 420 has expired previously and been unavailable for a period. That period last time was about 6 months. It was a year after the original expiration, and it was given 6 more months for labor and kind of representatives of the real estate industry to figure things out. It is a complicated thing. It is the case that there are many people, and I referenced this earlier, there are many people feel like if you're going to try to solve the production problem by giving very, very generous tax breaks to property owners and builders of beautiful new, mostly luxury and market rate housing, you also have to pair that with addressing the fact that, there are a million New Yorkers, million apartments, 2.5 million or so New Yorkers who live with basically no protections for the stability of their tenancy. But there are other issues too. I mean, the question of we view this as a public expenditure, and when you do large public expenditures to construct things, it is broadly recognized that there is consideration for what kind of jobs you're creating, what the union workers are going to do, what both the building service workers who are going to work in those buildings, as well as the construction trades that build them. That negotiation has been, it's been widely reported, it's been ongoing, and it's been very complicated. There is not an agreement right now between the trade unions and larger real estate interests about what those provisions should look like. And I think that is, for better or for worse, that is a necessary piece of this. And it would be, folks like me would be reluctant to just say, there's an impasse, they can't decide, we'll just pick a side on that. So it would be strongly preferable if they can figure out the terms of that, of what, given the enormous subsidy, what workers will get. And there are, good cause eviction, which, is the radical proposition that you shouldn't be evicted from your home for no reason at all, or no good reason anyway, is something that a lot of folks think is an essential part of this. And I'm optimistic that we'll put the pieces together on a broad deal that includes rental subsidies, some eviction protections, and some incentives, a tax incentive for producing housing in the course of this term, ideally by the budget, because some of the things I just mentioned involve spending money, and the budget is due March 31st, which is Easter Sunday, which is a day of miracles and other things. But certainly by if not then by June when the session ends. There are obviously, just for what it's worth, we've also there's some room for optimism around commercial conversions. there are some companies that are thinking that the city has estimated they might get 20,000 new units out of that. There are some people in the industry that think you might get quite a bit more. So I think there are other aspects of this, but I think a lot of us recognize that the core, that tax policy that gives an incentive in exchange for producing the right housing at the right affordability in the right neighborhoods is a key part of this.
Before we jump to audience questions, one other thing I want to just ask on this topic. As you know, because we've talked about it a number of times, CPC has been a real proponent of not forgetting that most of the development that happened as part of the 421A program happened outside of large real estate and outside of Manhattan. And we actually in the Housing Problem podcast, just for season 3, little plug, we just actually interviewed Vishaan about his article in the New York Times. And while one of the controversial things in that they did was they looked at as of right development in buildings that didn't require zoning changes or increases, so contextual development, and found that there's hundreds of thousands of units outside of Manhattan that could get developed that way. And so to me, that's also an indication that while I get it, right, we're leaving this to big real estate and labor to sort of figure it out, I'm not sure that that's actually the answer, because I think a lot of the development that we could get in the city is not big real estate and is not in Manhattan. And so I'm curious, your thoughts. The old 485 W, was that what it was called?
It's
The
X.
40
It's X
it's
this
X
year.
now, I know.
Hopefully it won't get
right?
to Y. We'll just
Had
do
a
it.
whole separate program in it for to incentivize smaller development outside of Manhattan. Do you still see that as a part of the equation?
Yeah, I think it's important. Look, we have to. The prior program often, it appears, incentivized development with very generous tax breaks, and the rents that were purportedly the affordable rents that was the public benefit we were buying for those very generous tax breaks, the maximum rent you could charge in the affordable units exceeded what the market is doing in some of those neighborhoods. So it was not it was not a terribly well designed program. I would argue partly that's because one of the houses of the legislature was held by a party that largely did not have members from New York City and was, interested in ensuring that some very generous benefits flowed to a particular industry rather than trying to get the policy, the sort of elements of it right. But yeah, we want a policy that incentivizes more development. It's not, there are parts of the city where you have the suburban style NIMBY dynamics that are going to be, a separate question with some of these developments. But I think we do want to increase production, and we do want it to be spread. There's only so much land I represent Lower Manhattan. There's only so many places we can build, super tall buildings in Manhattan. So we certainly need to depend on that. I will also say the stuff that Dan Garodnick and the mayor and the city of Yes, folks are talking about are also, there's a lot of very positive things in there where they'll try to basically try to allow routine production to happen in a lot of places. And I think that that's also promising.
Great. Well, I think we're going to turn this over and take a few questions from the audience. Do we have any? Yeah, over here.
You noted that much of the development will occur outside the 5 boroughs, and I've always been puzzled about last year's negotiations, etc., regarding transit-oriented development, which is largely in the suburbs and areas where they're not going to be paving over parks. They're not going to be tearing down single-family homes. I grew up in Nassau County, and I know where the train lines are, and there's generally nothing within hundreds of yards from the train lines. So therefore, the NIMBYism, other than, our schools might get more crowded, I don't understand the resistance. What was the resistance in the legislature?
I would say the resistance is in the communities. The resistance is among the New Yorkers that we represent. There's this idea the legislature failed. The level, I support this stuff. So And I think again, there were people said that the governor's proposals didn't quite get some of the details right, which is inevitable in something so big and so complicated. But focusing on transit, focusing on ensuring that each community is figuring out how to build the housing that they need for their own population. This is a very common, this is a almost ubiquitous phenomenon in America. Everywhere, every state, every suburban area, there are exceptions. There are sort of limited exceptions, little towns and villages that have overcome this. But for the most part, people resist developing new housing of any substantial scale in their communities across America. And again, most states, in some cases, many years ago, addressed that fact. But there's the local government and the local people defend the needs of the existing residents, and the rest of us should think about the existing residents, but also all the other residents who might want to live there at some point, and the sort of overall benefit to the economy of having more housing. But the resistance is really intense. I had people say to me with a straight face, "You really can't have anything more than 3 stories anywhere on Long Island." And I say, why? Like you're sitting in your beautiful leafy backyard in the suburbs, and you know that 3/4 of a mile from here they're building, 4 stories with retail on the ground floor and nice, pedestrian-friendly space, and there's some foot traffic, and some people actually get to live there. But it's very intense. In my view, we do need to overcome this and figure it out. And I think that I think focusing on transit is a particularly valuable way to think about it. But it's the opposition is intense. There are legitimate concerns about, like, when you think about schooling. I mean, Long Island is one of the most segregated places in America. Newsday did this wonderful piece of journalism where they went in, they sent people in to pose as people looking to live there, and in half of all cases, trained, licensed real estate professionals overtly discriminated against families based on their race. 49% of all cases on camera. We subpoenaed these people. Many of them came in with their lawyers sitting at their elbow and still articulated the value of discriminating against. And I think that there were penalties recently meted out for that behavior. But some of it is really insidious segregation and discrimination, wanting my school district to stay exactly as it is. There is a question of how you fund it. If you have a piece of property that you're putting a lot of families on, and they're going to generate a lot of kids for the local schools, and not as much property taxes coming from that because it's more efficient and sensible, there may be some legitimate questions about whether funding schools so heavily with local property taxes intersects with our desire to build housing in a way that's needs to be addressed. But this is the opposition is really intense, and it's not legislators waking up one morning and thinking, "Oh, gee, I just don't want housing in my community." It's individuals, local governments, counties, everybody.
We'll go here, and then we'll go jump. We'll do 2 more.
I'll be
All right.
quicker.
Okay, thank you. First of all, and then 2 caveats. One, the New York City definitely don't, and 1, 2, this is very pessimistic, but the housing shortage is definitely a national crisis, if not an international crisis across cities worldwide. Are there any models that we can look to that are getting it right? I mean, there ain't really cities that are just like you said, San Francisco and California also having huge displacement issues. Are there any kind of
Yep.
models that you're excited about, following, like in national or international?
Yeah. I have a couple thoughts, but go ahead.
Okay.
John.
Yeah. No.
So the question was, just in case, since we don't have microphones, in case people didn't hear it, was, are there any national or international models? Because the housing shortage is a housing shortage all across the country. I would say 2 quick things on that. In relation to this previous question, if you just go west of the river, take a train ride into New Jersey and see the development that's happening along the New Jersey transit lines in New Jersey. Okay, it can happen. Suburban communities are doing it. They're just not doing it in New York suburbs. So we need to figure that out. The second thing I would say is California actually has done an enormous amount. Another plug for season 3 of the podcast. We interviewed we interviewed the advocate that organized a bunch of that stuff. It included accessory dwelling units. It included incentives for new rental housing production. So there definitely are models.
Yeah, I would just quick note, New Jersey did it because of a lawsuit called Mount Laurel, where the state government and the localities opposed it for a bunch of years. Eventually, they were ordered by the courts. There subsequently have been kind of statewide administrative processes to get that stuff approved. And yes, the New Jersey suburbs of New York City are producing more housing per capita than the New York suburbs of New York City because of intervention but initially by the courts and eventually by the state government.
And a rail system that needs money, but that's
that's I'm working on congestion pricing in the MTA right now, but and the path gets nothing either. We have to work on that. No, I don't think there's any magic bullet here. I do think. In addition, I agree with what Rafael just said. I also would say there are places that are experimenting with other kind of models of housing, cheaper production. There's the Five-Borough Institute here in New York has been floating this. They put out a report about ways you might do housing that is cheaper to construct because of more, shared accommodations. So I think there are other approaches, but I think the core of it is, getting the incentives right and overcoming the opposition that people have to building housing in their communities.
And I would just add quickly, even though I'm no expert on this topic, New Jersey did pass some version of a good cause bill, and the world didn't end. So there's that, which is good. Last question here.
He knows way more about this than I do, but I'll just take the top level for a second. Just when we did the HSTPA, we were told that the entire rent stabilized sector is going to go bankrupt. You can't do this. You can't live in this world. Substantially, like people who are, my perspective, people who are in trouble are mostly people that are over leveraged because they bought not based on the current rent roll, but on some expectation that they could flip apartments, deregulate, et cetera, and dramatically increase the rent roll. That, since June of 2019, has been a very bad idea, but there are some people whose financing structures predate that, and it's a problem. I would acknowledge it to be a problem. It's separate from the longer term question of how we sort of make sure the operating costs are being covered, but I think...
I would just say quickly, and for the record, we are the managing partner of a joint venture that just purchased $6 billion of distressed loans from the FDIC that were formerly Signature Bank loans. So we're getting our arms around all of it. What I can tell you is that the interest rate environment is definitely a big part of the challenge and the issue. The average interest rate on the portfolio that we acquired is around 4%, 4.25%. They are all adjustable rate. They all are resetting. We're going to do a lot of loan modifications. There's going to be some patience that's going to be required. One of the great things about the structure that we got into is we're not regulated like banks are, so we don't have to mark everything every quarter. So we're going to restructure some notes, and we're going to be patient. That's 35,000 units in that portfolio. There are clearly other portfolios. New York Community Bank has been in the news. There's a lot of differences in the portfolios and how they're underwritten. But there's no question that the triple whammy, right, of rents not maybe for really good reasons. I'm not arguing about the reasons, but rents not being able to rise the way they had been able to, expenses going up dramatically, and interest rates being where they are today is having a huge impact on existing occupied residential real estate. And I think, the tax question is a really important question. So I'm thrilled to hear the senator acknowledge that the tax equation for those properties might be different today than it was pre-2019. That would be a big benefit. And I think there's going to need to be some patience to allow a lot of this to get worked out.
All right. Thank you all for coming. Senator Rafael, thank you for all you do. We're really grateful. And I'll just say, if there's anything that our community could do during session, this is obviously really important. Please let us know, because I think no matter what the deal is, our community would love to see something happen. So thank you.